between September and December of 2018, I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin.
So just a bit of Jody Wilson-Raybould from earlier this week as she testified before the House Justice Committee. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister maintained nothing untoward happened during their discussions, highlighting the amount of jobs that are at stake.
Canadians expect their government to look for ways to protect jobs, to grow the economy, and that's exactly what we've done every step of the way. We've also done it in a way that has respected our laws and respected the independence of the judiciary.
Now, despite what the Prime Minister is saying, he now faces opposition demands for a police investigation and a public inquiry. And yesterday, Trudeau did shuffle his cabinet. He filled the vacancy for Veterans Affairs that was left behind by Jody Wilson-Raybould when she resigned from cabinet in the wake of the SNC-Lavalin affair. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Star Vancouver's David Ball, who is in Campbell River, BC. In Winnipeg, Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, also an associate professor at the University of Manitoba's Department of Native Studies. And Daniel Biland is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada in Montreal. Hello to the two of you. Hello to all of you, rather.
Hello.
Bonjour. Hello. Hello.
David, I want to begin with you. You're in BC, and of course that is Jody Wilson-Raybould's stomping grounds. That is where you've been covering her career for more than a decade right now. Given that all that we have heard this past week, amongst the things that we've heard coming from Jody Wilson-Raybould herself, how is this being perceived in British Columbia?
Well, I'm actually here right on Kwakiutl territory, which is her people's nation. So this is really her stomping ground. You can see the ocean behind, and so I think here it's obviously a deep sense of pride that we've heard from her family and people close to her. I think in the Lower Mainland and BC in general, I think people feel a deep sense that she has kind of taken on the perceived Ottawa elite, or that the idea that this is business as usual, and I think they deeply underestimated her.
Deeply underestimated her, and in fact a lot of people have been saying that. Nigan, Jody Wilson-Raybould was this country's first Indigenous Attorney General and Justice Minister, and in an op-ed you wrote that she's staying true to her Indigenous roots. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I think what you saw this week is evidence of what it takes when Indigenous peoples bring their principles, their values, their ethics to a national stage. Of course, we can talk about sort of doing the right thing, but truly, where she's talking about Quapaw values throughout the speech, and particularly when talking about coming from the big house. She brought the values of the big house to Canada's biggest house, and it was taken in ways, of course, that I think has been misconstrued, and people have wondered, oh, what is her end game? Her end game is ultimately to talk about the ways in which, if this country is truly to reconcile, whether it was way back in the 1983 constitutional negotiations by her father or now, it has to reconcile with Indigenous values, and an ongoing extraction agenda and various other dubious work that's being done just doesn't fit with those values.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we talk about that, because of course Jody Wilson-Raybould's the one key player that we've heard from this past week, who we haven't heard from yet are, for example, the Prime Minister himself, although he has not said if he's going to appear before the committee. And I do wonder, Daniel, what type of pressure would Trudeau have been under? What type of pressure would he have been facing regarding SNC-Lavalin from many levels? Because they do continue to make the argument at the end of the day, they were trying to protect jobs in Quebec and right across the country.
Yes, I think the pressures came from different sides, and they still come from different parts of Quebec. So there is, of course, SNC-Lavalin itself. They have been lobbying for years over this. They started to lobby about this during Stephen Harper, and they have been lobbying about this since the beginning of the Trudeau years, since 2015. And also pressures from the political class in Quebec. Of course, from the Premier, Premier Legault, spoke about this even after the testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould, and discussing the importance of jobs in Quebec regarding SNC-Lavalin, and also pressures even from the Bloc. So the new leader of the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Blanchet, said a few days ago that jobs are very important. He said that he actually he thought that Jody Wilson-Raybould made a credible testimony, and he's not saying that there is nothing there, but the focus is still on jobs and keeping these the headquarters of SNC-Lavalin in Montreal.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because people are trying to essentially balance out the political equation here, because yes, we've heard Jody Wilson-Raybould say that she was feeling undue pressure, but up against that is the issue of jobs. So Danielle, I'm going to stay with you on this one. What type of political price will the Trudeau government face in Quebec for trying to intervene regarding this decision around SNC-Lavalin?
Well, it's a bit early to tell. We need to hear from other people in that story. It's a story that's moving really fast. What is sure is that the perception of, say, Wednesday's testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould was a bit different in Quebec than in other parts of the country. So I would say that in other parts of the country outside of Quebec, it was really it was a political tsunami in many ways. And in Quebec, it was more like a big wave. And I think it was a strong testimony, and people are asking questions about the legal aspect of this, and asking questions about whether the Prime Minister acted in an improper manner. At the same time, there is a lot of emphasis on jobs and on SNC-Lavalin, which is a large international corporation that has its headquarters in Montreal. And because Quebec has lost a lot of headquarters in recent decades, especially of large international companies, this is a very important issue for Quebecers and for politicians in Quebec, both provincial and federal politicians.
David, what do you say to that? Because again, we continue to hear this defense from the Trudeau government that what they were trying to do was protect jobs in Quebec, and that it was their duty as a government to make sure that undue harm did not come to the workers of SNC-Lavalin. What type of weight does that argument have in British Columbia, given the fact that economic insecurity is something that many Canadians can relate to regardless of where they live?
Yeah, I would say that we're very familiar with the argument. And we, of course, have that over the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, now the government, the Enbridge Pipeline, mining and forestry. So this is an old debate that people are used to here. I think what's resonating more, though, is the idea that this is a very powerful company, and that Trudeau is looking out for his own seat. Because he mentioned that. I remember he said to her, allegedly, I remember I'm the Papineau MP. Like, he was concerned about his prospects. So are they concerned about jobs? Because they've said all kinds of things.
David, I'm going to pick up here because we seem to have a bit of an issue with your line right now. But Nigan, I want to bring you back into the discussion because I'm going to ask you a question. But ahead of that, I'm going to play a bit here of Jody Wilson-Raybould once again. This is her testimony from earlier this week. Take a listen to what more she had to say in front of the Justice Committee in Ottawa.
I will conclude by saying this. I was taught to always be careful what you say because you cannot take it back. I was taught to always hold true to your core values and principles and to act with integrity. These are the teachings of my parents, my grandparents, and my community. I come from a long line of matriarchs, and I am a truth teller, in accordance with the laws and traditions of our big house. This is who I am, and this is who I always will be. Galakasla. Thank you.
Nigan, how important was it for Jody Wilson-Raybould to end her testimony in that way for an Indigenous audience across this country?
Well, she ended that passage that you just quoted there with alakasla, which is the word that means thank you, but it also means welcome. And what it would, if anything, this is welcome to what reconciliation actually looks like. It's the hard conversations. It's not about people giving up their values for agenda, economic agenda or otherwise, which Indigenous peoples are always tossed to the side when it comes to economy or money or power. But in this case, I would ask the main question, what kind of jobs does this government want to invest itself in? It talked about offering op-eds to support the idea that former Minister Wilson-Raybould, by chaining her decision, would be legal, when it clearly wasn't. It's offering jobs to an organization that is paying for multiple illegal activities, including escorts and various other things, to support and lobby people to engage their economic agenda. There is a severe ethical problem in this issue, and by former Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould bringing ethics into the equation, it's laid bare that the Trudeau government has a massive issue with ethics. Not just ethics with Indigenous peoples, although that's a severe issue. Ethics involving the legality.
I do want to pick up on the Indigenous issue, though, because this is a Prime Minister who had a lot of goodwill extended towards him because of where he publicly stood on the issue of reconciliation. How much of a hit has that now taken, and can that actually be recovered? Nigan, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, it is without doubt that, and the fact is that Indigenous peoples, while have historically supported parties like the NDP, did support the Liberals in an overwhelming amount and did swing ridings in their favor. And as a result, I think the Trudeau government in many ways extended relationships to the Indigenous community and interest in ways that never perhaps a Canadian government had done before, but had operated in the same fashion that they have for 150 years, which is that Indigenous peoples are good and fine as long as they smile, never rock the boat, never bring ethics and principles into the equation. But as soon as we do that, then we're cast aside or undergo personal attacks or marginalized or ultimately erased, tossed out of cabinet. These are major issues that the Trudeau government's got to reconcile with. And if my social media feed is any example, which is pretty much the majority of Indigenous activists and speakers across the country, nobody's posting selfies with Trudeau anymore. No one is talking about reconciliation is here. In fact, what I would say is there is more acrimony and anger with this government than perhaps ever before, and people lining up to support former Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, but also to support the larger issue of the problem this government has with reconciliation, as you've seen in recent weeks.
David, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Well, here on Quakiel territory, talking to her family members, she got into politics knowing full well how the game is dirty at times. I interviewed her back in 2014 before she actually ran for the Liberals. They just approached her to run, and she had to go back and ask her big house leaders and elders what she should do. But she went into this with her to be a candidate. So that voice that Nigan's talking about, that people are kind of asking questions now, people, I think in general, beyond the Indigenous community, are seeing a woman who's treated extremely unfair, been given. She's only had one story, and it's been consistent over this whole thing, and I think that's going to hurt Trudeau.
Danielle, I'm going to end it with you right now because we now look ahead towards Gerald Butts. He, of course, being Trudeau's former principal secretary, he's actually going to testify in front of the Justice Committee on Wednesday. Is there anything that he can say in front of that committee to turn this around for the Trudeau government?
Well, I think it will be very hard. The testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould was strong, was detailed, was passionate at times. She laid out a case with a lot of, I think, background evidence that she provided. Names, she named 11 names. She had a very clear timeline. She took a lot of notes at the time. So I think it's a uphill challenge for the Trudeau government, and of course for Jerry Butts on Wednesday.
Thank you for that, Danielle, and thank you to all of you. We're going to keep on this story, so perhaps we'll get the chance to speak again. In BC, Star Vancouver's David Ball joined us from Campbell River. Nigan Sinclair is with the Winnipeg Free Press. He joined us in Winnipeg. And Daniel Ballon is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada in Montreal. Thanks, guys.